Greenberg's really significant. This is a review. What I like to have you read is a review that he wrote in 1948, and so this is pretty early as we're talking about abstract expressionism, hitting the scene. It's really in the mid to late 40s that it's really developing. People are starting to pay attention to it. The artists, outside of the art world, and especially the New York art world, it's in 1948 probably that they're really starting to begin to get some critical acclaim. But in the larger art world and the more popular press, you begin to see that happening around this time and then crossing also over into 1950 and kind of the early 50s. So this is really the time frame that all of this is really starting to come together. So this is a short essay that Greenberg wrote and published in the Partisan Review, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And I wanted to have you read it in part because of when it was written, so 1948, it's written in this milieu and in this context, and also because of what he's talking about. And the title of it is The Situation at the Moment. So even from that title, you should have an expectation that he's talking about, well, what's happening right now. And keep in mind, it's a pretty short article, so he's not going into a great amount of detail, but he's talking about what he feels are some significant issues of his time. So that's the reading there. When you look at the assignment sheet, basically what I'd like you to do is read Greenberg's essay, The Situation at the Moment, that was originally published in the Partisan Review in 1948. Write a response to it in which you address the following. So based on what Greenberg says, what is the situation at the moment, right? So I think when you see that title, your first question should be, well, what's the situation? What is he going to talk about? In it, Greenberg speaks of a crisis. So as you're reading it, think about, well, what is this crisis? What is he presenting as being an issue? And also consider, does he offer any solution for the crisis? Because if in that title he says he's talking about the situation at the moment, he brings up this issue of crisis, he's identifying that, but the next question should be, well, what does he think is going to happen, or what does he think should happen? So try to address those three things. If there are any words that are unfamiliar to you, look them up. Include words and their definitions in your response and receive up to 4 points. So basically, at the very end of your response, you can simply list the words that you were unclear on and what they mean. My reason for doing that is because when I talk with students, sometimes it'll come up. They'll say, "Well, I just didn't understand the reading, and there was this word, and I didn't understand what that was." And then I'll say, "Well, did you look it up?" And they'll go, "No." And I'm like, you look it up. It's so easy. And it's so much easier now. You don't have to have a big dictionary, to have at hand or carry around with you. You can look it up on your cell phone probably, or computer or whatever. But a lot of times, if there's this word that doesn't make sense, you look it up, and then it's like the light bulb goes off, and you're like, oh, okay. Now in the context of what I'm reading, this is much clearer. So what I've decided to do, I started this last semester. I'm going to reward you for doing that. So if you make that little bit of effort to do that, one, you're probably going to understand more clearly. Two, ideally, you'll hopefully improve your vocabulary in the process and understanding in general. And then three, you get some extra points for it. On my end of things, I'm always looking up words. I'm always coming across things that either I don't know or I think I know, but then I'm not sure that I really do know, and so I look it up, or I'm writing something and I look up the definition of a word that I want to use, but I want to make sure that it means specifically what I want it to mean. So looking up words should just be kind of common practice. I did make a note here, and it threw me a little bit, and I had to look it up to make sure I understood it properly. Because when you read the sentence, you're like, what the heck is he talking about? It's like the weirdest sentence out of context. But he makes what seems to be an odd reference to whistling in the dark. He's referring to an old expression, to whistle in the dark if you feel frightened. There's also an old custom of whistling while walking past a cemetery. And both of these are based on the idea of doing something physically distracting to mitigate fear. So when you find that sentence, if you think about it, what that means in that context, it'll help that to make more sense. And interestingly, when I looked up that phrase, one of the first things that popped up was the reference to, and I think it was a radio play as opposed to a film, but it was a popular radio play that was called Whistling in the Dark. and it was like a crime thriller, kind of thing, and it came out right around this time frame, like a little bit earlier than 1948. So I think that phrasing is something that was like slang, that was really, current in the time period in which he was writing this, but I don't think that we use it so much today. Your response should be, this is in the following format, and this is really a standard format, for me, for just about any class. Type, double space, 12-point font, 1-inch margin. I left the due date blank here because I knew I wanted to adjust the time on this a little bit. But I think what we'll do is let's talk about, have it prepared, and we'll talk about it in class on Monday. And I think that's the 26th. Is that correct? Monday the 26th? So have us ready to turn in on the 26th, and then we'll talk about it a little bit at the beginning of class, too. The other thing I made note of on the assignment sheet here too is a little bit about the Partisan Review, where it was published, because this is sort of interesting, and we'll talk a little bit more about these issues shortly. Not today, but before we leave abstract expressionism. So I put the history of the Partisan Review is notable. A small magazine published in New York City 4 times a year, so it's just like a little quarterly magazine. It focused on literature, politics, and cultural commentary. It was initially supported by the Communist Party USA, and that was back before communism had become a dirty word. And think of the history of Soviet communism in particular, Russian communism, is that it develops early in the 1920s. The USSR is calcified as a Soviet communist country in 1924, so pretty early. And there were a lot of people in general, like globally, who were really excited about this new form of government. And it was very utopian and really, idealistic, especially in, through the 1920s and continuing, but less so through the 1930s. But what happens is pretty quickly, people realize that it becomes a very oppressive and repressive regime, and so there's a lot of people that step away from it or distance themselves from the Soviet Union in particular. But there were a lot of people in the West who still kind of embraced the ideals of communism itself, and then that really becomes squelched after World War II, and especially as we go into the 1950s. So today, communist or communism still has that aura of something terrible and against democracy, and so it's like a derogatory word. But in this time frame, it wasn't so much, and it was, especially through the 30s, but it was changing, certainly, in this time frame. So by the late 1930s, the editors were critical of Joseph Stalin, who's the leader of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union. By the 1950s, it had a social democratic perspective and became deeply anti-communist, so it makes this switch. The other thing about the journal is it was also in a lot of financial trouble. It almost failed at a certain point. And this is based on some recent things that have come to light. The CIA financially supported the magazine during the 1950s and 60s as part of, as part of its covert effort to bolster American democracy and to shape American opinions. But that was something that nobody in the time really knew about. And in the 1960s, the editorial offices moved to Rutgers University and then to Boston University in the late 70s, and the last issue was released in 2003. So it was really a journal that was functional, especially in the middle part of the 20th century, but it really struggled in the later years of the 20th century, and now it's now defunct, but survived until relatively recently. The thing about the CIA, and this has been in some news stories recently, we'll talk about it in the next week or so, was that the CIA supported abstract expressionism, and certainly supported this journal and other things, but it also supported abstract expressionism in covert ways, because there was this idea, and again we'll talk about, I'll kind of mention it today, but we'll talk about it in more detail later. But there's this idea that abstract expressionism was an expression of democracy itself, and that by promoting this style, then it was promoting democracy, but particularly American democracy and Western European democracy as well. But again, this focus on America, and so that's a sort of an interesting story that we'll come back to and we'll touch upon. Any questions or concerns so far? Yeah.
When's it due?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's due on Monday the 26th. I took your sheet away from you. So have it prepared for Monday, and then we'll also talk about it a little bit at the beginning of class and try to answer any questions and clarify things. So it's pretty straightforward. But one of the things, whenever you're reading something written in the past, the kind of tone and kind of pattern and rhythm of writing oftentimes is different, so it may feel a little strange, in some ways as you're reading it. I think Greenberg has a very particular way of phrasing things too. One method to keep in mind, if you ever read something and it feels awkward or you're kind of caught up with that, try reading it out loud. And there's something about, I do that too. There's something about reading out loud that sometimes it makes things make sense better. If nothing else, it's the pattern of saying something versus reading, or it may also be, from your own perspective, it may be the process of reading and speaking, kind of engages your brain a little bit differently too. So consider that if you find it a little awkward, but let me know. All right, anything else before we go? Good. All right. We're going to pick up today with Willem De Kooning. And he becomes one of the best known and really significant abstract expressionists in the late 40s and through the 50s. And really, he was working up until his death, which is like the late 90s, early 2000s. He has a really very long life and is essentially working as an abstract expressionist throughout his career. But we'll really focus on this time frame here. The date on this painting is 1950. One of the things about De Kooning is that when you look at his broader body of work and broader career, is that he's a European foreign artist who's from, you know what? I want to say Belgium, but now I'm second guessing myself. It's either Belgium or Holland, isn't it? And that's terrible that I can't remember. Somebody can fact check me on that. But he comes to the United States, and he's essentially an illegal alien for a really long time. He actually had bought a ticket on a steamship to the United States that was supposed to be round trip, and when he gets to New York City, he got off the boat and just never, came back. Essentially never went back home. So, and I'll explain a few things because it'll help, I think, to make sense in some things about his work, but also in the way that he's often talked about it as well. And so when you look at his early European training in art, he receives fairly traditional training, with an emphasis on observational drawing and observational painting. If you look at his work from this time frame, he's painting the figure. And he's really painting the figure up through the early 1940s, kind of mid-40s. And then as you get to the later 40s, and then especially this work here that's completed in 1950, his work is as non-representational as it gets. And in a lot of ways, he's presenting this painting here called Excavation as a non-representational painting. And the reason I say, presenting it as is because I find that the more you look at it, you begin to see things that remind you of the figure. Would you agree with that? Do you see that as well? Yeah, like what do you see?
Flesh tones.
Yeah, there are flesh tones in some ways.
You can see the silhouette of people in their outfits.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know that I've thought of outfits before. What do you
Like
see?
on the left side, to me, I see that black figure is a man sitting.
Oh, like a seated figure. Yeah. So here, like a body,
Yeah,
seated in a chair.
Right beside it.
Yeah.
And you kind of see what they're wearing almost.
Yeah. What else do you see that seems to evoke the figure?
It seems like they were like eyeballs or something.
Yeah. The more you look, you begin to see. Let's see. I know there's several. Yeah. Like, whoops. Like here, like an eye. The dot in the center. Anything else?
Well, I was trying to look up, but I can't connect to the internet. So where he's from,
Oh, okay, that's cool. Thanks. Nobody finds it.
It just looks like there's a lot of gestures.
What's that? The Netherlands. Okay, so he's Dutch. Yeah, well, I want to say Belgium, and then as soon as I thought that, I'm like, it's not. I think that's right. So from the Netherlands or Holland, whichever term you want to use. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Yeah.
No, I just feel like there's a lot of gestural movement,
Mhm.
and you can it does kind of mimic movement of dancing of bodies going around.
Yeah, so there's a kind of energy, and and that's something to consider. This is again, and I feel like I'm gonna wear out this phrase, and it's true for this particular style of art, but true for a lot of art, is that his work is more interesting in person. I think when you see it in person, you certainly get a sense of it in reproduction, but that energy that you're getting a sense of looking at here is even more pronounced when you see it in person, when you can see the brushstrokes. And the other thing about De Kooning too is that his method of painting also used a lot of erasure at the same time. So what I mean by that is he would lay in paint and then he would scrape it off, and then he'd lay it in, he's working at oil paints, and take it off, and lay it in and take it off. And you basically see that, or you see the evidence of that when you're looking at the work. It doesn't have this kind of flatness, in a sense, that you see when it's in reproduction. There's more of a translucency to it, and you can kind of see the actions of the artist better when you're looking at the work. But yeah, I think that evidence of what seems to be, it's kind of like the figure's been, and it's not even, broken up and analyzed in the way that we think of cubism. It's kind of like and it sounds kind of morbid, but it's like the figures were put into a blender or something, right? So the kind of thing's really kind of macerated and sort of chopped up into little bits. So yeah, references to eyes and maybe teeth and mouths and so on. And for De Kooning, this is really as far as he goes with non-representational work. And in 1950, with this work being made in 1950, it's really reflecting this trend toward, totally abstract, non-representational painting that's becoming, or it has become really popular. So we can see him, kind of, following in this direction. But even though there's still little kind of these remnants of the figure that are hanging on in this work. I think the title's interesting. Excavation is kind of interesting. It's almost like you are the excavator, right? And to excavate something. Maybe it's me and my background, but I tend to think of it as archaeology in a way. You're excavating something to find things. And I feel like the more you look at this, it's like you're excavating the image and you're finding things as you kind of sift through it. But fairly quickly, De Kooning creates a series of paintings that collectively are known as the Bloomin Series. You have this one in your textbook, Woman 1. All of these paintings in this series are made between 1950 and 1952, so a 2-year period. And these really become his best-known works, and these are the ones that really set his career. These are the ones that are, getting attention by MoMA and other, significant American art institutions and critics and so on. Although one thing I have to say about critical reception of De Kooning's work is that while other critics really responded favorably to his work, Greenberg had issues with it. And based on what you know about Greenberg so far, why do you think he had issues with work like this? Yeah.
Maybe it was too representational.
And that's exactly it, because it's representational. And in Greenberg's point of view, the best painting was pure painting, right? It's paint. It's not, a painting that's representing something in the real world, like a figure or a chair or a table or a landscape or whatever it might be. And so what De Kooning was essentially doing here is he's got the language of abstract expressionism, especially if we're thinking about gestural abstract expressionism or action painting, which is it's sometimes called. Remember that Rosenberg coins that phrase. And because what we're seeing in this painting in a sense, are the traces or the remnants of the artist's actions and movements and so on. And again, with De Kooning in particular, it's something that you can really see in person better than I think you can, certainly can in reproduction. So he creates a series of paintings. You've got Woman 1 in the textbook. There's also, just to give you another visual here, there's Woman and Bicycle from this one is dated to 1952, and you essentially see this, repetition of a standing figure, or maybe like a 3/4 length figure, sort of in this abstract expressionist background. But as you look at these images, what do you notice about the figure that kind of jumps out at you in some ways?
It's generally very creepy.
Yeah, this is interesting. Female, certainly. What identifies as female? Yeah, large breasts, right? Also, maybe not so much in this one here, but almost the face almost is a little skeletal in a way. And that mouth, right? The red lipstick, and we see that image repeated. So, Aubrey, you mentioned that this seems kind of creepy. How many of you feel like this is a creepy image in some ways? How many of you maybe respond in a less creepy way? Yeah, and that tends to be a pattern that some people look at it and go, "Oh, this makes me uncomfortable," and other people go, "Ooh, I'm going to kind of like it." Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, since you brought it up, Aubrey, what's creepy or what feels creepy about it?
The mouth.
It's just
Yeah. Yeah, so what about the mouth specifically?
Like they're over exaggerated, and especially in the golden one, it's just like grossly maintained.
Yeah, it's over exaggerated, almost like the figure's got buck teeth in a way, or maybe even almost animal-like, fang-like, maybe almost.
What's interesting is it's like the face is the only part of the painting that makes it into a figure. Because like if you cover up the face, you don't recognize it as a figure.
Yeah, it would be much harder to. If you look at any section of the painting, you just looked at an area, of the paintings in this series, they look really non-representational. So if we think about the figure, especially anything that represents an eye or a mouth, something like that, we're going to need a breast maybe. But the breasts I think even need to be in context with the face. I think if you didn't have the faces, you might not read those forms, or those shapes, in that way. That certainly allows us to say, oh, there's a figure in here, and then you kind of work for looking for the rest of the figure. And that's something that also happens in analytical cubism to a certain extent. You begin to sort of realize, where the references are to the figure, and then suddenly that image, as a representational image, begins to make more sense. For those of you who feel like it's not creepy, how would you defend it as not creepy? Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like, what's his name? Is the Joker? Not Heath Ledger, but
Oh, from the TV series?
Jack Nicholson.
Or Jack Nicholson. Okay,
How
sorry.
he just had that like really
Okay, so it was
he
lots
just
of
kind of had like a more happy smile than a like creepy
Yeah.
kill everyone.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
At the same time, there's like
less incongruent.
yeah. But at the same time, it just kind of makes me like want to laugh. Like I
Yeah.
feel like that lady just got done shoplifting from a store and is writing off.
Just like, that kind of thing. Yeah. So there's some kind of chaos there. So you're responding to this, to the kind of maybe kind of a happy chaos in a way. And if you like order, then maybe that chaos is kind of threatening, in some ways, or uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to add to? Yeah.
I mean, it is creepy, but I think the use of bright colors helps it. Gives that, like she said, a feeling of happiness.
Yeah, it tempers it.
Because he could have used really dark colors, and then it could have really pushed the creepy woman forward.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good. That's
Surrounding her with all these.
It kind of
bright
makes me
aspects.
wonder what he thinks about women. Is it scary? Does he think women are scary, or does he think they're humorous? Or
Yeah, we'll come to that in just a moment. Actually, yeah.
Was his mom like this?
Yes, other issues. See, now you're taking now you're doing Freudian analysis, right? So that'd be taking a Freudian note. It's all about childhood and sexuality, and
What's also
all of that.
interesting is that the only aspects that define it as female are markings on the face and the breasts.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it actually has a very masculine shape to it. It has really broad shoulders.
Yeah, kind of broad at the
Yeah.
top, narrow, kind of more narrow at the hips. Yeah, and so I find, how people respond to this work, I think, is really interesting because, and I've had, some students say, well, this figure seems big and bold and powerful, and they see it in a positive way, and then other people say, oh, it seems really overbearing and, uncomfortable. So I think it's interesting how we bring all these different ideas. The painting certainly doesn't change, really, but how we think about it and ideas that we bring to it, it can affect how we interpret it. And that's something, and I'm going to emphasize that a little bit, just because it's made me consider that that's really typical of modern art, and certainly modern art as we see it developing in the first part of the 20th century and then continuing on through at mid-century, is that one of the characteristics of modern art is it's requiring work from the viewer, right? You've got to look at the painting, you've got to interpret it. Some artists have very fixed interpretations of their work, and some artists don't, or they're kind of in between or a little bit ambivalent. Some artists say, well, this is what I think about it, but you bring your own experiences to it, and you're going to have a different, you may have a different take than I do. Now, one of the things about De Kooning, to kind of talk about this idea of his ideas about women, let's just phrase it that way. He actually liked women quite a bit. He was married for a long time and spoke favorably of women. But one of the things that he did early in his career, before his career as an artist really took off and he could be a full-time artist, is he worked in advertising and design. And so he worked as a graphic designer and did a lot of layout. And when he was interviewed in the 1960s about what he was doing in this time frame, I think it was in the 60s, like late 60s, I think it was the time frame of that interview. He talked about how he was thinking, when he was making these paintings, he was thinking a lot about advertising. And one of the things you see in advertising in this time frame is you see a lot of the use of red, and especially when you're looking at, and he was somebody who worked in print media, so like magazine ads and that kind of thing. When you look at magazines of the time period, they generally have relatively limited colors. When you do lots of full color, it gets expensive. The color red gets used a lot because it's very certainly attention-getting. And one of the things that he talked specifically about in this interview was that he began to notice how women were being used in advertising, that women were being used to sell things. And he was, kind of lower, in the hierarchy of design. He wasn't the person who was inventing the ads. He's the guy who's creating illustrations and doing layout and that kind of thing. So he's getting told what to do, basically. So he's got a little distance from the creation of these images, but he's working with them. And he talks about how women were being used for advertising, and he began to notice that especially you would see this repetition of this emphasis on eyes and mouths in particular. And, typical of the kind of fashion of the time, that bright red lipstick was something that was really common. And if you look through any magazine from this time period, and you see it over and over again. So I just, kind of pulled this image off. I'm not even sure what this was an ad for. I'm not even sure what car that was, a Ford or something like that. It's got these fabulous seats, right? That things you get in and out of the car. But notably, this woman is being used to advertise the car. It's like she's an accessory, right? She's not the driver of the car. She's in the passenger seat, but she's like an accessory, with the car itself. So this is the kind of imagery that he's thinking about that's influencing this work. Yeah. Question?
Before you showed that, when you were asking who thought maybe it wasn't creepy, I thought it wasn't creepy because she looks like, in the larger piece, that she looks kind of tired.
Yeah.
I feel like he's made an image of a woman that's, really tired, but she has to keep up appearances almost. Hey, here's my smile.
Yeah, frazzled.
It's a little creepy, but she just looks like somebody that has worked.
Yeah.
And he's kind of representing that to me.
Yeah, and I feel like that's where, the viewer, brings those ideas forward, and certainly forward in the work. For De Kooning, I think he was tending to think about it in a more formal way. That you see emphasis on eyes and mouths and breaths in advertising, and that's essentially, if we jump back here, that's essentially what you're seeing repeated in these images. And then again, he's working, if we think about just the method of painting, he's working in this action painting technique where it's very, this energetic application of paint. You see paint that's, been kind of thinned out and dripping, and so on. I had actually I didn't have him for class because when I was working on my dissertation, but he was somebody I knew and I had talked to. He was one of the painting professors. And he was a second-generation abstract expressionist. So he was an abstract expressionist who came of age in the 60s, and some of his teachers were, artists of this generation. And I mention this now because we'll see this over and over again for a while, is he talked about the aesthetic of the drip. And he talked about being an art student in the 60s, especially in the early 60s, which was his time frame, as opposed to the later 60s. And he talked about how everybody had to have a drip in their painting. That drips were, people really paid attention to drips or running paint. A drip or running paint before this time period would have been seen as a mistake, right? The art that should be corrected. But suddenly, this drip becomes a kind of evidence of the intensity of the artist, right? So, and that drip, pattern that we can see can become kind of affected. Or feel, kind of affected in some ways. But I'll draw attention to it because we'll see that, again, over and over again, really, as we talk about abstraction, through the 60s. This work here is by Elaine De Kooning, who was Willem De Kooning's wife, so they were both artists. And this is her portrait of Harold Rosenberg. And this is also included in your text box. So remember, Rosenberg is the other important critic from this time period. And I think, and Elaine De Kooning, as opposed to Willem De Kooning, was really known as a portraitist. That's really her area of focus. And when you look at her body of work, certainly she does work outside of portraiture, but she does a lot of portraiture and a lot of commissioned portraiture as well. And if you think about portraiture, is that it, by its very nature, it has to be representational, right? So it's got to be representing somebody. And so when you look at her work, I think it's interesting to look at because what you're seeing is this kind of combination of two styles in a way, kind of two trends, and there's almost kind of a little bit of an internal conflict to a certain degree. Because, here she's got an image of Rosenberg, seated in his chair. It's like he's having a casual, conversation there. It's pretty relaxed there, not so formal. He's not sitting with perfect posture and so on. So it's if you see photographs of him, it's recognizable as him. But she's bringing an abstract expressionist method of painting to the image. So she's combining tradition, portraiture, and creating a likeness and recognizable subject matter, but she's bringing the energy, and notice all those drips, right? She's bringing the energy, that directness of painting that's associated with abstract expressionism, and kind of blending, and in a sense, blending the two together. And then a portrait of Rosenberg in this way, really makes a lot of sense because he's a critic who's really a champion, for this style and for this artist. So it's like an abstract expressionist type portrait of him, but it's again representational as opposed to abstracted. So even though we're in a time frame when abstract expressionism is the thing, right? It's this style that's it's avant-garde, right? It's at the forefront and is pushing, kind of forging ahead and pushing boundaries and setting setting new ground or creating new ground in some ways. There's still room for more traditional ways of thinking about painting at the same time. So I think that's worth, certainly making mention of. The other thing that Elaine De Kooning too is, and this is where, to a more educated viewer, and certainly to somebody like Rosenberg, she's making references back to the beginning of modernism in many respects. This painting of Rosenberg is oftentimes described, or the references are made to Edward Manet's painting of Emile Zola. And Emile Zola was a writer, and we think of him today as an art writer and an art critic of the 19th century. Edward Manet is one of the artists who helps define what modern art is. So famously, one of Manet's famous paintings was Olympia, and you see a reproduction of that tacked on the wall of Zola's not studio. I don't know what do you call a room in which you write? It's not really a studio, office. A study. Study. I like the word study. So he works in his study. So he's seated on a chair in front of a writing desk. There's a Japanese screen here, a Japanese print, an image of Manet's painting of Olympia from 1863, and then another print behind it of a print by Caravaggio. That's called I've forgotten the title of it. It's Drunken Bacchus, basically. Los Borrachos. It's called Los Borrachos, which translates as the drunken men, basically. And so what Manet is doing here in this painting is he's kind of making references to what's happening in this time period. Manet's style is, he kind of ups the contrast. He's got this looser brushwork. Manet, as an artist, we could talk about as a realist who becomes an impressionist, and work like this is really transitional from realism toward impressionism. And it's the impressionists who are considered to be the first modern artists, and the beginning date of modern art we think this modern art in the Western tradition is 1863. So this really this person who's depicted, the artist who's painting the image, kind of certainly represents the beginning of what the trends are of that time, and who the influences are. People like Caravaggio, Japanese prints coming into Europe, and so on. And so Elaine De Kooning, in some ways, is doing the same thing, doing the same kind of thing, but in the visual language of her time, and making references to the styles and trends of her own time. Robert Motherwell is also one of these artists who's in this group of abstract expressionists that we think of as being gestural or action painters, depending on which term that you want to use. Some of his works have representational qualities, such as this here. I think most people pretty quickly see the references to male human anatomy relatively quickly, but again in a kind of abstracted way. A lot of his work is non-representational, but it makes references to this work and this time frame in particular. And it's kind of an interesting and strange story behind it. Motherwell had traveled in Mexico for a period of time, and when he was in, it was before 1943, and during the time frame when he was in Mexico, Pancho Villa, who was the kind of celebrated leader of the Mexican independence movement, had been assassinated. So the history of Pancho Villa is that he was a military leader who became like a civic leader. He had been in power for a period of time, then kind of fell out of favor, and he was coming back into, he was trying to come back into political life, and was killed. And kind of famously, there was this ambush. And he was in a car with several other people and was ambushed, and just when you see photographs, it looks pretty horrific. Like everybody in the car was just shot. So they're full of holes. The car's full of holes and so on. And so basically, he was eliminated by the opposition, and it's usually talked about as an assassination. The Motherwell had the experience of seeing newspapers and seeing the news accounts of the assassination, and it included photographs of Pancho Villa and the people he was with in the car. So you actually see they're like forensic photos in a lot of ways. But some of those images were published. Other images that were also published were images of the bodies without clothing laid out on hospital beds. And so again, they look like forensic photographs, and they were images that made their way into print media. So this was an image that really kind of stuck with him. He begins to kind of work, with these images, and they're images again that aren't. You wouldn't look at this, I think, without the title and think, oh, Pancho Villa, in this dynamic in this situation. But what he's doing is he's kind of working out, having seen these images, and as we'll see, and we'll really see this more as we talk about Jackson Pollock. But some of the abstract expressionists are working in an almost kind of Freudian, or for Pollock, a Jungian analytic model, where you kind of figure out what's what's bothering you, what are you what concerns or ideas are you nursing in a way, and you give expression to those things, and you go back and you revisit and kind of work with those images and ideas over and over again. And that's kind of essentially what Motherwell was doing. So he creates this work in 1943. The other thing about this painting too is it was collected by MoMA. And it was collected pretty early when we think about the development of abstract expressionism. And Motherwell had a lot of connections with MoMA. He spoke really well about art. He often participated in symposia and lectures that were being held and organized by the museum. He talked with curators. So he's somebody who was very articulate in how he talked about art and abstract expressionism in general. And because of that, he's kind of connected within the network as well. So his painting, in a lot of ways, really marks his career taking off. What happens with Motherwell is he creates a whole series of paintings that become known as Elegy to the Spanish Republic, and they all have different numbers. So he does other paintings too, but he works on these paintings over a really extended period of time. And but you see these basic repeated patterns. There's essentially this big black, shape, almost pendulous in a way. That if we think of, the paintings are abstract, but I think it's hard to look at them and not think about fields in a way, that there's this black form in the front, or it's hanging or floating in front of whatever the colors and marks are behind it. But you see these big black pendulum-like forms in front of other shapes and other colors that oftentimes tend to be more predominantly formed. You also see this pattern of black and white as well. When Motherwell talked about this work, it's another good example, I think, of how the work does not have subject matter, but it does have content. For him, he was thinking about these forms almost in a metaphoric way, to where they represent the balance of good and evil in a pretty traditional, standard way, of black being evil, white and other colors, especially brighter, warmer colors, representing good, the powers of good in a sense. So his elegy to the Spanish Republic is also a reference to a dynamic that begins in the pre-war period, and that's the Spanish Civil War that breaks out in the 1930s and is resolved with the establishment of a dictatorship. That's active, in the time frame that he's creating these paintings. So again, I don't think that the average person would come up to this painting and go, oh, this, without a title, and say, oh, I see, this is about the balance of good and evil in the Spanish Civil War, and all these different things. But it takes some work, certainly to get there. Yeah.
I was just wondering what medium was he using, because it looks like acrylic to me because of his layering, especially in the last one. It looks like it's like colors are on top of each other, even though they've been laid.
I think that they're oil paint. I would have to double check. I don't know if anybody has the book, so if they want to double check that. I believe it's oil, but it's possible that it's acrylic. The thing is, in the 50s, what we think of as acrylic paint is kind of, for artists, is not fully there yet. Most artists are working in oil. It's really the second generation of abstract expressionists that we begin to see using acrylic paint. Pollock is using latex. We think of his drip paintings. In a lot of cases, he was using house paint. And the reason he was using house paint had to do with the viscosity of it, that it was a more liquid, form. If he was using traditional artist paint, he'd be using a lot of it, which would be because you'd have to thin it down. And it would be harder to get that kind of texture that we associate with house paint. But there is acrylic paint what we think is acrylic or latex paint is developed for commercial purposes like painting buildings and walls in the 1930s, but artists were using it for mural painting. So they're aware of it. But with this, does it say with it? It's oil. Yeah. So I was pretty sure that it was oil, but I don't associate Motherwell with latex paint in the way that other artists like Pollock. The other thing too with these works is they look different in person. There's more subtlety to them because when you see them in reproduction, you tend to lose that kind of transparency, especially that comes with oil.
I'm just thinking because the lines are so crisp, like even the last one.
Yeah, they're less crisp in person. Yeah, so we all need to go and field trip to Noma because that's where most of these paintings we've been looking at are. The other thing about his paintings is that they're also really large in scale. The Birmingham Museum has one of his paintings that was made in the 1970s. It's really kind of on the format of this one here. And I wanted to bring in an image of it, but I couldn't find an image online of it. And it's a painting that tends to go off and on display. They don't usually put it in the vaults. They usually move it somewhere else in the museum because it's so big. They actually don't have good space for it in their storage area. So sometimes it's in the contemporary gallery, and then other times there's a seminar room, kind of a small room they use for meetings. It's kind of a long rectangular space, and sometimes it's in that space there. One of the things we talked about, one of the things Greenberg certainly emphasizes is the scale of paintings, and paintings moving away from being easel pictures or easel paintings toward mural or mural-sized paintings. And this is also an issue we'll come back and revisit with some other artists. We're almost out of time, but just enough time so we can finish up with Motherwell. This image here, rather to give you a sense of scale as well. And this is a little bit later in 1965. He's the guy who's standing here at his solo show. So pretty early in his career, he gets a big show of his work. But I'll leave you with this quote here, and we'll come back with it on Friday. So don't worry about writing this down because we'll come back to it on Friday. This is from a symposium held in 1949 where he participated. And this is what he says, that art is a form of action, a drama, a process. It's the dramatic gesture itself in modern times. Not a religious content, but it counts for art's role in the minds of men.